Welcome to episode 9 of This Valorant Life. Join Adam and myself as we do a deep dive into key Valorant mechanics, from peeking to movement and utility usage. With that, let's jump into it. Hi everyone, welcome to this episode 9 of This Valorant Life. In this episode, Adam and I will be doing a deep dive into mechanics and really trying to understand better when to use certain ones, what are the things that we need to think about. And so with that, Adam, maybe we'll start with maybe one of the most foundational, which is peeking. So maybe you want to just quickly define the difference between a deady peak and a non-deady peak, or a dedicated peak versus a non-dedicated peak.
Okay. So a dedicated peak to me is very much, I guess, let me kind of back up. When you peak, you're kind of exposing to an angle,
Hmm.
regardless of a dedicated peak or non-dedicated peak. When you make a dedicated peak, you expose to the angle when your crosshair is in the wall, and then you're coming out and making that crosshair in the open on the angle you want to fight. So essentially, you're pre-aiming the angle before you take the fight and before you expose. On a non-dedicated peak, you're not really pre-aiming. Maybe you would trace your crosshair a little bit along the wall, and that could be considered a peak. Or maybe you would be pre-aiming something else, but then you accidentally dedicated peak another angle. So I think ultimately, by making that distinguish between the two, dedicated peaks are much better than non-dedicated peaks because you're much more ready for the fight.
Sure. Okay. What about when you are just doing like a no stopping peak, like where you're just like in and out, where there's maybe just one moment of dead zone and you're leaving? Is that a dedicated peak in your mind?
I don't think so. I think like when you're in and out like that, that's a little bit more so like a jiggle peak or like a
Yeah.
pre-fire type of vibe. A dedicated peak, as it sounds, is like you're very committed. Like you're gonna
Hmm.
strafe out, really anticipated for that duel, and if he's on that angle, you get the kill instantly. At least
Okay.
hopefully.
Okay. And so in your mind, before you're peaking, are you always making this decision?
100%. I think I don't know if all the players do that, but I think that's kind of something that took my game to the next level. I heard this phrase from CS:GO, or maybe it was from Valorant, but basically you clear your corners religiously, and for me that meant clearing every single angle that I peek religiously. Like I anticipate there being an enemy there, so if I'm actually gonna move into that angle, I'm gonna go with that movement, like with intensity or like anticipation, or I don't know how to better word it, but like it's not lazy. And
Yeah.
sometimes, that does happen. I would say though, like 80% of my actual angles, like peaks that I take, I'm ready for. And like the 20% I would say are more lazy.
Yeah. I don't know who said it. I think it may have been Teets. He's like another YouTube guy for Valorant, but someone was talking about how like professional players are almost never surprised
Hmm.
because they're always expecting someone there. So someone has to be in like a completely unexpected occasion for them to be surprised. Otherwise, they're always peaking as if they're there. Whereas I think for the lazier player, the lower elo player, we're often peaking and we only like half expect someone to be there because they are only there a little bit at a time. But the problem is like then we're not actually peaking it with the rigor that lets us set it up for success.
Yeah, I think that's true. Like the anticipation factor is a really big one to be able to react quickly. Like even if you think about dodging a flash, like if you
Yeah.
look at a high level player, they know that this is a common area for, let's say, belong unbind, right? And you're walking up on attack. A lot of people flash and swing that. So if you're a high level player, either you play anti flash or you're so ready for that flash that if you see the animation or you hear the flash sound, you're gonna turn it, right?
Yeah.
Whereas like maybe a newer player, um, they have the same reaction time as the other player, but because they weren't ready for it, they just get flashed.
Okay.
So I think that completely applies in the range of peaking as well. And maybe that's just like a skill that's not really talked about, is like with higher level players, you kind of know, I guess, like risk assessment wise, like where players can be and then like how likely
Mhm.
they are going to be there. So we have a little bit more emphasis on those peaks, or like maybe utility to, clear those spots. Whereas like I could very easily imagine, at least like when I started playing CSGO, was like everything was a threat. And like I would clear everything. And then because I cleared everything, I would be ready for nothing. So yeah, hopefully that helps.
When you're entering a site, like the Deddy peaks, like Deddy peaking every angle, It's very much like post util, right? That's in my mind. Like, late in a round, you're trying to like clear every angle, make sure you're taking your fights well. Like, how do you balance peaking and your strategy around peaking, like the beginning of the round when, you know, there's going to be, let's say you're on attack side and you're exploding into a site. At that point, you're not really deady peaking, are you? You're just going to be trying to run onto the site, supporting your teammates. You're going to try to put in your AD strafes where you can, but you're pressing a lot of W. Like you're not really just, you can't really, if your team has thrown all of their util to execute on a site and people are out, you can't really be deady peaking, or you can't be like doing like really rigorous peaking in that sense. I don't know. What do you think?
So I think to answer this, I kind of want to go to two extremes. So think about utility and the time on the clock as both currencies. So let's go in the far extreme end where you don't have utility at all, but you have all the time in the world. If you're entering a bomb site, you would rigor peak everything. You would have dedicated peaks. You would take 2 minutes just to clear, one half of the bomb site, right? But if you go to the other extreme end, you have very little time, but you have the maximum utility. Say you have Harbor Ult, Raise Rocket, Sky Cabbages, like all this stuff that you can util bomb the site. It doesn't matter what movement or peaks you have, they're just going to die,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And you can do that really quickly. When you're going into a normal execute, what you need to keep in mind is, do I have a lot of util here to let me kind of go W key fast, right? And this is also why dive duelists are so valuable, is because they cut down the time frame that utility is thrown and they're on the bomb site, so they don't actually have that W movement, right? So if you think about it as a jet dash or a satchel, as soon as like a dart is thrown or a nade is thrown, they're there. So the enemy team can't really capitalize when they're scaling on site as a normal agent would if they were to hold W, right? That's why ciphers or sentinel players in specific struggle so much against dive duelist, because one half of their setup is going to be like kind of run down
yeah,
a little
yeah,
bit. So that's kind of how I view it. Is like, if you don't have dive duelist and or you don't have enough utility to scale into site, you have to slow down. And sometimes
yeah,
you'll see people literally just shift walk into the site, maybe because they're scared of trips or they're scared of people actually peeking them. So by getting rid of that noise factor, um, they minimize the amount of risk they have, where the defender can kind of time their peak on them,
okay,
right? So going back to the bind belong example, let's say we don't have a dive duelist, and let's say like our util doesn't clear enough of the site. You might just like entry out and clear close left out of belong, like that little wood pallet spot, and then you
yeah,
might just like shift walk up till you get to front site and
yeah.
to close that gap and then start taking duels.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. That makes sense. Did you have anything else to say on peaks?
I think the biggest thing with peaking, the biggest, I don't want to say mistake, but just really emphasizing that like the anticipation factor, because like sometimes I'll see people peek out and they'll like do this weird stutter step where they're like peek out and then like, act as if they're AD holding an angle instead of just peeking out and stopping, or peeking out and continue moving. I see this a lot with newer level players, like in gold or silver. They'll do a really short step, which doesn't give
Yeah.
them time to register that there's an enemy or not there, and they'll just like AD strafe until they're ready to kind of realize that there's no one there. So I think it's a combination of not taking wide enough steps so that they can actually register what's going on, and then also I'm not being anticipating a fight on that angle.
So the next one I had was crosshair placement. So we've,
Mm.
I think everyone who's gotten into Valorant understands crosshair placement is a pretty fundamental skill and mechanic to get better at the game. But how did you work on your crosshair placement?
So this is a hard one. Maybe we can kind of define crosshair placement first. A lot
Sure.
of people think about crosshair placement as head height,
Yeah.
and kind of like maybe you would pre-aim through the wall and peek, or maybe you're holding an
Yeah.
angle, you put it close to the angle.
Yeah.
I think for me, what crosshair placement is I'm putting my crosshair where the enemy player is, and it sounds obvious, but I don't think people make that distinguish. Like that's like there's a little bit of separation there. And to kind of clarify further, if I'm putting my crosshair where the enemy, I think the enemy is, I want to put my crosshair in a way that I think I can actually get the kill. So this is most notable when you hold angles, because a very common problem when people hold angles is, of course, if you put your crosshair right on the edge of the wall and they swing, they are there, but you will never get the kill, right? So you have to hold a little bit wider. Same for peeking. If you peek and you put your angle right against the wall, sometimes if they're in the little bit of the open a little bit, it's harder for you to get that kill. So maybe kind of defining that first is, it's not exactly where you put that crosshair, or sorry, it's not exactly where you think they will be. It's more so if they were there, do you think you can get that kill? So for practicing that, really, I think it's like a lot of deathmatch. It's really important for you to kind of experiment with getting, I guess, less aim in your kills. So for example, if I'm holding here, I just want to try to click and get the kill, right? So
Yeah, just click timing.
click timing, exactly. I would experiment with holding really tight, holding
Yeah,
really wide, kind of meeting in the middle. Maybe I would experiment with AD strafing a little bit. Maybe I would experiment with off angles, but just finding like that sweet spot where I can literally just put my crosshair there and click. And what comes to mind for me is the Haven B site fight. If I'm swinging from, or if I'm on B site as a defender, holding mid window,
yeah,
that's an angle that you should be comfortable with. Just having them swing and clicking, because that's a very
yeah,
straightforward fight,
yeah,
right? And then you can go for reps like that in deathmatch, and then eventually, when you hold more and more 90-degree angles, these are the more angles where you would hold. That crosshair placement really matters, because if you're on an off angle, they don't expect you. Then you kind of get a good feel for how wide your crosshair needs to be. So that's, I would say, number one, just practice holding angles.
and in practice figuring out how wide you need to hold for your reaction time and what you
Exactly.
feel comfortable with.
Exactly. And then as for crosshair placement with moving around the map and peeking and all that type of stuff, I know a lot of people talk about like tracing corners as you move around
Yeah,
the map. I think I do that like when I have to W key on an angle a little bit, but like in game, especially in deathmatch, if you ever watch any of my deathmatch VODs, a lot of the time my crosshair's in the wall because I'm trying to peek something. So I think crosshair placement can be like elusive in the sense that a lot of people think that you need to have your crosshair on an angle at all times, like your angle snapping
yeah,
between every single corner. And it's good to have that, I think, but also you need to understand what your intent's like. Am I getting ready to peak, or am I actually trying to hold here, or am I like scaling up on an angle? Because those are three different techniques in your movement, and your crosshair placement will differ between all three. As we've already said, peaking, you would have pre-aim. So
yeah,
that would mean your crosshair's in the wall. If you're holding, that means your crosshair is pretty wide. If you're
yeah,
scaling, maybe your crosshair is on the edge of the wall, but a little bit wider, so you have time to react, right?
yeah.
Those three different techniques and movement patterns, I think, play a huge part in what your crosshair placement is.
Is it something you're always thinking about, or now would you say it's fairly automatic?
It is fairly automatic. I would say, like, if I were to think about it, maybe it would be better, but I don't want to add to that mental stack. Like maybe if I play a deathmatch and I'm super nailing down my crosshair placement, it would improve a little bit. But like when I'm playing, for the most part, I'm really thinking about that. So maybe for newer players, that's something they could really dial in on. But hopefully, it becomes natural over time.
And then crosshair placement is usually talked about distinguished from aim training,
Hmm.
you know. But one thing is that you probably can't have great crosshair placement if you don't have some fundamental level of mouse control. So have you seen that before, where guys or students in general don't actually have the mouse control, like the raw aim they need to actually crosshair do proper crosshair placement?
I think I do see it, but it's a little bit harder to see. What I see when that kind of thing arises is someone on a really high sensitivity will have decent crosshair placement, then they get swung and then they jitter their crosshair off target. That's the more common way I see it. But I could also see it being in the sense of like their flick speed isn't quick enough to get a kill and then flick to another side to hold that angle because they're about to get swung. And they're kind of just like lazily dragging their crosshair. So like because they don't have the mouse control to get from angle A to angle B, I guess this is an example of angle snapping. They aren't there to get their crosshair placement in time.
I see. I see. And what have you found with your students has been most beneficial in improving their crosshair placement?
I mean, that's a hard one, but in terms of, I always recommend no audio deathmatch, specifically with the sheriff. And I think for this, normally I prescribe it to improve their peaking because you have to be very thorough.
Yeah.
But I think like by as a byproduct, because you're peaking so much and you don't have sound to crutch, your crosshair placement does have to be pretty good.
Yeah. You have to really turn it into a click timing game to have
Yes,
any hope with a sheriff,
very
because you're
true.
not going to get you're not going to get any kills by spamming.
Exactly. Yeah, that
Yeah.
first bullet is huge.
Yeah. And why no audio?
No audio, so you can't like crutch on the sound part of it. For example, if I hear all these footsteps around me, I would change the way I peek, and like I kind of know where the enemy is. So when you think about that like anticipation factor in ranked games, people aren't running around like that. They would shift walk up and then they would use util. So because you're getting reps, all these reps where you can hear the enemy, when you go in ranked games and you don't hear them, you're just gonna get completely like crushed. And I think that's why a lot of people say they can't translate their deathmatch aim into real games because they're crouching on their sound.
I see. I see. Yeah, they're crouching on sound and holding, knowing where people are going to be.
Exactly. Or like deady peaking based off of audio. So like they
Okay,
don't thoroughly clear off angles.
I see. I see. So just building bad habits
Yes, I think so.
that then translate into the game.
Hmm.
What about utility usage? So I think, the prior to is something people talk about all the time. Utility usage, not so much. What what do you think in terms of utility usage, in terms of there's times I think where there's high leverage usage and low leverage usage. Like how would you define those?
So high leverage, I think, is util that converts directly into a kill or directly stops your teammate from getting killed. So this
Okay.
is normally at the start of the round when you're taking map control, so you don't die to an opper, or maybe in the post plant when the retake starts and you're using util to counter them. Right. I think that's where you get the most value out of util. Low leverage util, I would see it more so in like micro fights or like you're delaying for a second. For example, like satchel bumps. When
Yeah.
you play Raze, you throw satchels at enemies just to delay for a quarter second or a full second. Of course, those can convert directly into kills as well. But in the grand macro scheme of the game, you're not really influencing the game compared to, like, say, you're Sova darting early in the round to get info at a certain location.
And so I think the high leverage versus low leverage util change depending if you're on defense or attack. So let's say you're on attack, and maybe we can run through the different classes. Let's say you're in attack. If you are a duelist, what does high leverage util look like as a duelist?
Well, that's probably something related to making space. You can commonly think about entry duelist as dashing in, satcheling in, or neon sliding in or something. Maybe you would flash and make space, but as long as you're making some sort of space, and you're not instantly dying, then that's pretty high leverage. Maybe moving on to initiator,
Yeah.
high leverage util would be something like using your info to take map control. And more importantly, is to prevent your teammates from dying most of the time. I think a lot of people have this misconception of, I want to use my Skydog or my Silver Drone here to convert a kill, but it's more so to prevent your teammates from dying because defenders have the advantage, right? And there's so many off angles. So
Yeah.
to me, that's pretty good util. For controllers, I think it's just well-timed smokes.
Yeah.
If you're going for an execute, you want to make sure your smoke is on the right choke point or in the right spot so your duelist doesn't die. And then I guess for Sentinel, just making sure you have your util spread out. So if you do have to cancel and execute, you still have map control.
What are the mistakes people on attack, let's say, do where they take their util and they use it in a way that doesn't get them much leverage?
The most common one, the most common one is throwing. I coined the term. I didn't coin the term, but I use the term for fun utility.
Yeah.
So people will literally just throw stuff with no intent. So the most common one I'll see is just someone throwing a silver dart or a sky flash or any type of flash randomly on the map somewhere, and they're not actually using it to take map control. So it could be used, I guess, if you're trying to condition them or fake that you're making pressure there. Like it has value in that sense, but it's much lower value if you just throw the same recon dart a long on Haven every round and it just gets
Yeah.
broken and you're not
Yeah.
fighting with it. Right. So I
Yeah.
think that's a very common low leverage one. I guess another one would be along the same note is if you're just throwing random controller smokes and there's no intent behind it, then it's pretty wasted. Yeah.
Okay. And what about on defense then? What does, if we run through the categories again, what does high leverage usage on defense look like? Because I think this is where maybe there's more of a trap where I think I've seen it at least, or I've noticed where sometimes players don't want to use util because they don't know if they're going to get value. Like sometimes you'll get players, let's say on Lotus A, where
Okay.
you nade the entrance for the A site, where the attackers come out. Like sometimes you'll have teammates that are all in. They'll nade, they'll slow, they're all with it. And sometimes you'll notice that teammates just don't want to use util because they don't know if they're going to get any value. I mean, what does high leverage usage look like on defense?
So on defense specifically, I try to think about it as like a resource game. So the amount of util that you trade compared to the enemy util that they trade, if you let's just use that raise nade example. Let's say
Yeah.
attackers use everything. They flash, they smoke, they even jet dash, and then you throw one raise nade and then run up and kill the guy that dashed. You've traded one piece of util for three pieces of util, right? So that is worth it. The easiest way I can maybe explain this is like because the choke points are so tiny, your util value is increased because as long as you stop the choke point, um, you've essentially canceled the rest of the util that they've thrown. So pretend like they Sova ulted, Brimstone ulted, Harbor ulted, everything to take the site, but then they can't get out of the choke point because there's a molly there or a nade there. You've completely that's super high leverage, right?
Yeah.
Um, so maybe the guide defenders a little bit is it's a game of map control. You don't want to give anything too easily. So, if, for example, on Ascent A main, I see a lot of people just fight a little bit and then fall back, or maybe they don't even contest A main for the entire game. So now we're just not doing anything, and we're gonna get util dumped on site. And then if we do have the molly, maybe you can cancel that out. But most of the time, you're just gonna get run over. So the way you can kind of leverage your util there is just trade a one way into a main and then maybe have one player fight with it. And then all of their util and map control is canceled. Maybe to simplify that a little bit more is as defense, you have to try to play for map control somewhere.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if you're not playing for A main, you're going to be playing for mid or B main. But if you're not playing for A main, mid, or B main, you're not getting info anywhere and you're going to lose.
And so the heuristic would be you want to trade your util on defense for map control.
Yes, 100%.
I would say most people, I would say at least like I'm low elo, like in low elo would trade util to like stall, which is very distinct from trying to trade it to like actively take map control.
Like you're not really fighting for it, you're just stopping this player.
Yeah.
And like the answer to that, like sometimes it is better to stall and delay, but if you're using all your resources to stall and delay like a rush, your teammate on the across the map needs to go and take space somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Okay.
and
Okay.
that doesn't normally happen.
Okay. So what about the trap of trying to use your ult at the very best time?
To be honest, as the game has progressed with the ult charge increase, maybe there's a little bit more value in trying to get more perfect ults.
Okay. Yeah.
Because
Because all the outs have gone up by one or
yeah.
2 points.
So I think that argument is becoming a little bit more true. However,
Okay.
I think like you just need to win the round, right? If it's like a 1-7 game, rip all five of your ults just to get round two because you need it, right? You need to get on the board somehow. If it's a close game, rip your ult, like every round counts, right? So
Yeah.
even if you rip your ult on an eco round, but you win it, it's probably worth it. So maybe that's how I would think about it is like, don't try to use your ult in the perfect way to get the maximum value, but use your ult to try to win the round because you can win the round with a little bit of your ult. And you might see this a lot from jet players. Like they're in a 3v1, but they miss an off shot and they pull out their jet knives to kill that guy. I'd rather them do that rather than, whiff their off shot, don't pull out their knives, die, and then it ends up in a 2v1 and then the enemy player has a chance to win. Like I'd rather
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
read that ult in the 3v1. Same
Yeah.
with the
Yeah.
raise rocket. Just raise rocket the
Yeah.
guy in the 3v1.
Yeah. Like, don't take any chances.
Yeah, no chances.
Yeah.
Just take the round.
Maybe the last one, I didn't have it on our list, but is movement.
Okay.
So, like timing your movement with your gunfights is important. How important is that? Like, how important is it to work on like the dead zoning? Is that important? Or how important is it just to work on your strafe timing? Because there's elements of crosshair placement and peeking in this, but it's also distinct, like those more extended gunfights.
Movement's a hot topic. I think with dead zoning specifically, it's gotten a huge rise in popularity due to Woohoojin's movement guide. And I think it's good that it's getting attention, but it's also a little bit misleading in the sense that he doesn't specifically say that's the most important part of movement, but it's the most viewed portion of his video. And
Yeah.
I get so many questions about it. So specifically with dead zoning, I think it's a lot less important than people think now that Woohoojin's video is out. It probably attributes to maybe less than 5% of your kills, where you would dead zone and pre-fire a guy. I think it helps with your movement timing, like understanding when you're accurate and not. So in that sense, it's beneficial. But I feel like you can get that feel with the normal strafe and stop, or a counter strafe. Some people counter strafe, some people strafe and stop. I think like you can kind of do that drill without needing the dead zone aspect of it. So hopefully that kind of clears that up. I don't think it's super important.
I think it's really challenging to do it in fights if
It
you're
is.
only dead zoning, like in terms of aiming and timing.
So I used to be in the camp of I would never dead zone in a fight unless it's a pre-fire. But like recently, like this past week or two, I've noticed I've been dead zoning in extremely long range duels specifically when I'm not actually ready to aim at the guy. So like if I'm playing against an op or I'm playing against jet knives, where I'm trying to stay mobile. So essentially, I'm not actually trying to kill the enemy player. I'm just kind of shooting warning shots while I'm preparing for the fight because I got caught off guard. And that's kind of where I use dead zoning. And it's been somewhat beneficial, right? Like I said, very long fights. I'm just strafing back and forth because I'm not really going for the micro adjustment anyways. It's just prolonging the duel so I can kind of get a good feel for what to do next.
I see. I see.
But very rare in my gun duels. And I think the next maybe thing to talk about with movement is you mentioned the strafing, right? Strafe
Yeah.
timings and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I think the important part there is just getting a good feel for what a good swing is or a good peak is. Like some people, like I mentioned earlier, swing too little, they swing too
Yeah.
shallow, and they just insta die, or they swing
Yeah.
too long and then they never shoot the guy.
Yeah.
Which, to be honest, I'd rather you swing long and never shoot than swing short and insta die, because at least you're pulling the crosshair for a little bit. But you do have to kind of find that good middle ground, and I do think
Yeah.
movement's super super important for that. And maybe to go on a little bit of a tangent with movement, really good players know how to kind of mix in jiggling, or they know how to mix in moving forward and backwards after they've shown themselves. So let me go into a little advanced example here to kind of showcase how movement is really important. Let's say you are really close to the wall, you
Yeah.
jiggle it a little bit, the guy knows you're close to the wall, you take 2 steps backwards, and then you go for a wide swing, or you go for a dedicated swing, or maybe you go for a crouch peek. But then like those, you can kind of see like all the different variations have kind of put into place with just one duel. You can take 2 steps back, or you can stay close to the wall, jiggle, wide swing, crouch peek, and like changing the depth is super huge here. And then with along with that peak there, I just named 3 different ways you could take that swing. You could wide swing, you could deady peek, you could crouch peek. And because there's like that mix up there, it's almost like a game of rock paper scissors. But you're leading them to think that you're doing rock, but then you would do scissors. So you can kind of trick them.
And so kind of using their crosshair placement against them.
Yes, yes. I guess
Yeah.
that's the best way to do it. You're tricking them with their crosshair placement.
Cool. Was there anything else that you feel like we should have covered?
Maybe like good ways to train it. I just want
Sure.
to quickly go through 2 things. One, you can go into the range and breach
Yeah.
ult, go into one of the sides, breach all the bots to one side, and then pick 2 bots to shoot, and they'll respawn into the center. So there's a lot of things you can do with these 2 bots. You can just stand still, shoot them, train your aim. You can train your bursting, you can train your spraying. You could dead zone between the two. You could strafe kill one and then strafe kill the next, just to practice your swings and all that. And then specifically in deathmatch, I think a lot of people kind of praised deathmatch before, and then people kind of went away because aim trainers became a thing. I think the secret is to do a little bit of both. I don't think enough people are deathmatching currently. I think it's like we've overcorrected in the aim training category.
And do you have a preference between a team deathmatch before versus the regular deathmatch, or
If I
like
have
trying to improve on this stuff?
If I have more time, I would rather do deathmatch. Like I would rather do 3 deathmatches with 3 different guns, or say something like that. But if I'm short on time, I'll just run one TDM because it kind of covers multiple guns. But I do have a little bit of a bias towards deathmatch as of right now, whereas before it was TDM.
Why?
TDM, I think it doesn't translate with the maps, and I also feel like the way duels happen is very ARAM style. So if you play League of Legends,
Yeah.
you're all mid.
Yeah.
You get, I guess, reps with multi-frags, but it's not really like peaking technique. It's kind of just like you're there and there's 3 people on your screen and you're trying to shoot.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's a little bit less dialed in for that specific technique, which I
I
think is
see.
more important
And you're not getting the reps on the maps.
on the maps. Yeah. So
Yeah.
clearing those off angles and stuff like that might not translate as well if you were playing an actual deathmatch.
Cool. Cool. That's a wrap then. I think that's an interesting episode for us to talk about individual mechanics. Adam, thanks for taking the time, and we'll see you all next week.
Next week.